Zach's project is looking at 3D printing of items related to the story of the VOC wreck, the Batavia. It's done also in collaboration with the Western Australian Museum, and it's good to see so many people from the Western Australian Museum here this afternoon, and probably online as well. And I will now pass over to you, Zach.
Thank you. So in case you haven't quite looked at the slides yet, my name is Zachary Webb, and this project is called Batavia 3D Printing. There's a little bit of a story I'll run through about the Batavia. I'm not going to go too long because the actual story of the Batavia is incredibly fascinating and intricate, and is also a tragedy. But we'll start with the objective. So the Western Australian Museum is planning a travelling expedition for June of this year with a focus of maritime archaeology, and it seeks to immerse visitors in the actual world of shipwrecks and the secrets that are only discoverable underneath the waves. And the process, or the goal of this project, is to take photogrammetry data that was previously gathered and reconstructed, and convert it through a process to a point where it can be 3D printed into an actual coloured model, which then can be put on display on an exhibition. So now the story of the Dutch vessel, the Batavia. It was constructed in 1628. The construction was finished in 1628, I should say, and it began its maiden voyage in the exact same year. About 7 and a bit months later, after the ship was taken off course by one of the, I believe the captain of the ship, it ended up striking a reef about 65 kilometres off the coast of Western Australia near Beacon Island, and ended up sinking into the water. The crew, there was about, I think, 327, give or take a couple more, that were on the ship, and after the entire process of everyone getting to the ship, there was a huge massacre that happened after a mutiny was involved, and over 200 people ended up dying over the entire experience, so it's a pretty huge tragedy. Not long after the ship was abandoned, the location of it was pretty much lost to time due to a variety of other losses by the Dutch East Indies Company, the VOC. They had various ships lost during that time. The exact location was completely gone until it was rediscovered in about 1963. Shortly after 1963, the Western Australian government secured rights to excavate the ship from the, I believe, the Norwegian government, or the Netherlands government, sorry. And in 1972, the Western Australian Museum began its excavations effort after being assigned to it by the Western Australian government. Now, this project focused on 4 separate pieces of geometry, or photogrammetry. The 4 ones that we focused on was the actual wreck site itself back in 1970. So Andrew spoke of a person named Jeremy Green. He was one of the main people, I believe, with Patrick Baker as well, who took thousands and thousands of photos of the shipwreck back in 1962, which is 1972, which is an extraordinary feat just in itself because of camera technology back in the day. Nowadays, you think you've got an incredibly powerful camera on your phone which can take 1,000 photos, but back in the day, it was nothing like that, and so it's quite fascinating that they were able to do that much documentation. So they have the actual wreck itself from 1972 and the couple of years after that during the excavation. On top of that, we also have photogrammetry of the stern of the ship that was recovered from the wreck site in 1972. It has been since excavated and preserved and is now on display at the Fremantle Maritime Museum. On top of that, 137 sandstone blocks were recovered. Another interesting fact about the Batavia, it was carrying a large sandstone portico which was planned to be installed at the Batavia City, and well, when it sunk, it all fell to the bottom, and during excavation they ended up discovering a sandstone brick after sandstone brick, and after they ended up excavating, I think around 30 tons, I believe it was, of sandstone, they reconstructed it and built it into a massive portico, which can also be seen on display at the Geraldton Museum, as well as a replica version at the Fremantle Museum of Maritime. And in 2019, a freelance photographer, I think David Jackson, he went over to the wreck site long after everything has been excavated and took a variety of photographs to reconstruct photogrammetry, which was also done by the Hive. And these are the models that we currently have. So in the top left, we have the 1970 wreck site. This is all of the photogrammetry as we got at the very start of the project. Right underneath that, we have the wreck site from 2019, taken by David Jackson. Right in the middle, we have the reconstructed hull, which is currently viewable in the Fremantle Maritime Museum. And we also have, I believe this is the replica one, the photogrammetry of the replica one, not the one from Geraldton, but they are pretty much identical. And the exact sizes, I'm not quite sure, but these are quite large objects, as much as they might not be to it on the screen. And the project timeline kind of went out like this. During the very start of the project, we researched possible outcomes of the project, what we wanted to actually print and what we actually wanted to work on. I then went through the process of reviewing the photogrammetry and resourcing and figuring out how we were actually going to get the models printed. After that, we went on to develop the 3D models, select printing deliverables, so which ones we were actually going to finalize and select, and then modifying it, because there's a lot of small amount of tweaking that was required to do to actually get them to a printable state. And we'll be hopefully printing or sending them off to print in the next coming weeks or months before the travelling expedition in June. So the software that I ended up using, there was a huge variety of software, also other ones including like Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and Excel, but that's kind of a given, most people use those nowadays. The main 5 focused software was Autodesk Maya and ZBrush. These 2 softwares were used for model retopology as well as for modification and projection. The next 2 programs, which were more focused on textures and reconstructing textures, were Substance Painter and Adobe Photoshop. And then finally, for the final modifications to models to get them to a printable state, it was all done in Blender. Now, this is the original starting point. So one problem that you kind of have with photogrammetry is that it's a bunch of photos that have all been taken, and then you feed it into a specialized program which then judges depth from the photos and reconstructs the model. It does not do a really clean job of doing it. It's very messy. You can see in the photo on the right, or on the left, you can see the current photogrammetry model of how it was. And on the right, you can see the wireframe, which the wireframe just simply shows all of the edges of the polygons, and it's incredibly messy. And while it does work, it gives you the visually pleasing result, it's incredibly inefficient and not that great to continue working on, so it needs to be redone. So the first step was Retopology. It was taking the original photogrammetry and creating a brand new mesh. On top of the original photogrammetry, one problem that you do have when you're taking photographs of object is if you don't get the entire model encapsulated in the photographs, they end up being non-watertight and kind of flat models. So there is actually no structure to the original photogrammetry. It's just basically a kind of paper wall. So there's no inside. If you try to hold water into it, it would hold nothing. And so the first step to get it to a printable state is it needs to be a watertight model. And so that's what was done at the very first. Reminder that this is also done for pretty much most of the models. The portico was the one that required the most amount of work, is the most one that you can actually see the work, so I'm using this as an example. After the retopology, it came to projection. So with projection, you take the original photogrammetry and you give it to the retopologized one, and then based on proximity from the 2 models, you kind of paint or push the textures from the photogrammetry model onto the new one. And so you can see that with the retopologized one on the right, after it's had textures added on, there's a lot of white areas where there was previously no textures. So after that, we move on to texture reconstruction. So in texture reconstruction, it's just simply taking previous texture data and then extending it and using content-aware tools and brushes to kind of reconstruct it completely from scratch. It's a bit of a tedious process, but when you put enough time, enough effort, it ends up creating really good results. And the final process was, creating the final modifications for printing. So when it comes to printing, especially when you're printing in color in the material that we're using, it can get very expensive. And if you don't optimize it properly, you can end up having a print that's about 20, 30 centimeters tall ended up costing multiple thousands of dollars. So to reduce prints, one method that we were exploring, which we explored for most models, but this one is the one where it really came out, was hollowing the inside of the model. And so creating a hollow version, as well as following other hard restrictions and guidelines for the printing software or the printing service, created multiple different versions of it. And it can also be seen, I believe, in this one. So at the end of the project, we ended up coming to 2 final print files, which were supplied to the museum. The first one is the sandstone portico, which is on the left. It's completely ready to be sent off, and we're hoping to get that sent off soon. The next one is the reconstructed Batavia hull. So with this one, we had to do more than just simply throw it in and slice into 3 pieces. There was a large amount of supporting structures. If you actually go and visit it in the museum, it has large pieces of metals and spokes and wires connecting to a wall to simply hold it together. And since that wasn't really a part of the initial wreck, most of it, pretty much all of it, had to be removed. There's some that you can't remove, which you can see at the very edge of the stern, but that's okay. This model specifically was cut into 3 individual pieces to maximize the print size, or to use up pretty much all of the budget that we had left and create the most visible print. So the actual print size when this gets done, assuming that it gets done, will be about 57 centimeters long, about 30 centimeters tall, and about 20 centimeters wide. So pretty reasonable size, and it will likely look very good once it's constructed. Additionally, the 1970s wreck site was worked on. We explored a variety of different print options for the site, but simply print size was a bit of a worry, and texture detail coming out. So we ended up leaving this in the back burner and working on the other models in the end of it. Additionally, the 2019 wreck site was retopologized to create a more cleaner version, which could be used in digital programs like Unity and for other experiences in the future. And thank you. Before I finish, I'd like to make a few acknowledgements. Hopefully I can remember them all off my head. Andrew Wood, I would like to thank you for access to the Hive and making sure this happens. Rachel Hughes, I'd like to thank you as well. Everyone on behalf of the Museum of Western Australia, as well as the Fremantle Maritime Museum, I'd like to thank Jeremy Green and Patrick Baker for their work on making this actually possible, because they were the ones that went down and excavated and actually worked on this back in the 1960s.
Don't forget Carly.
Yes. You too, Carly, thank you very much. Wesley Lamont, Carly Tillett, Daniel Adams, yes. And then there's also David Jackson, I believe his name, which is the photographer that took all the photographs in 2019. And thank you for listening to my presentation. And Jonathan Ply, yes.
Primary supervisor, don't forget the primary supervisor.
Yes. He couldn't be here today, I hope he's online. Thank you.